Hi, in this video we're going to take a look at some of the lessons we've learned about helping customers undertake an IaaS migration. So that's when we're moving virtual machines or servers from a legacy data center into Azure. This video particularly, we're going to focus on the concept of a hostile data center migration. That's where the legacy service provider might not necessarily be on board with the idea of you moving to Azure. There's a lot of things they can do, sometimes intentionally and sometimes unintentionally, to slow down and prevent the migration experience from happening. So in this video, we're going to take a look at how we can get around that. So in the following slides, we're going to drill into the following ideas. What makes a data center hostile in the first place? What are the things that can actually force us to be stuck in there? Some of these things are technology, some of these things are political, some of these things are commercial. Then we're going to take a look at some pragmatic approaches we can use for undertaking discovery, assessment, design and build, how we get virtual machines out of the data center, how we get them remediated and imported into Azure as virtual machines, and finally, how we go about shutting down and serving notice on the legacy provider. When the idea of recording this video was first floated amongst the team here, one of the questions that kept coming up is, what is it that makes these data centers hostile in the first place? Some of our migrations we've gone into with hosting providers that have been nothing but helpful and supportive and done the right thing for the customer. We've also run into some projects that have been delayed and been quite painful for the customer purely and simply because they're in what we call a hostile data center. That means that the people that run their current data center may have a commercial agenda to try and keep the customer there for as long as possible. As you might imagine, in some cases you're paying per server per month in a legacy environment, but also as well, it's quite possible that there could be quite sizable financial penalties that work in the favor of a service provider. If, say, you're stuck in a data center after a deadline, that might mean that a service provider is going to get paid for another year of service. That obviously gives rise to some political issues that we need to be aware of. It's important that we understand the political landscape. And it could be a little bit more complicated than the political landscape on a typical consulting engagement. We'll talk about that a little bit more in the next slide. Some of the technical challenges that can come along get in our way are basically down to either the data center being oversubscribed, a lack of access to some of the resources that some of the traditional migration tools we would use would need. Separation of tools and infrastructure out in the waterline is a great thing for virtualization infrastructure. It's a little bit challenging when you come along to a hoster and say, hi, I want to move out of here, so I'm going to need access to your VMware hosts. I'm going to need access to your vCenter environment to do this stuff. And if that stuff's supporting a shared environment, quite naturally, the hosting provider is going to be kind of reluctant to give us the things that we need if there's the potential to undermine the performance of the environment. Apathy is something that can get in the way quite a lot. Quite often, especially with large customers, we can get into a situation where pretty much everybody is just sick of the idea of a migration. They've tried and they've tried and they've tried in the past to do migrations. They kind of feel like they're being held hostage, but at the end of the day, it gets to the point where people just shrug their shoulders. Apathy comes about when people just kind of lose hope, or they think that yes, there is a way forward, but it's incredibly difficult and incredibly painful. Some of the other things that can get in the way as well is process. It's tempting to think of data center migration as being something that should be heavily process controlled. And that's true. There's a lot of good practice around change, configuration, and release management that needs to be taken account of. However, this stuff can backfire on us. It can slow us down if it's not done in the right way. And mostly that's about risk and an organization's attitude towards the risks associated with a move. Now, unfortunately, if you are currently hosted in a data center that is not being as helpful as possible to allow you to get out, there are going to be risks involved. However, there are ways to mitigate and minimize those risks. Let's take a moment to drill into the politics of a hostile data center migration. What differs from most consulting engagements or systems engineering projects you might have worked on before is with an Azure migration, there are generally speaking 4 sets of stakeholders involved here. They all have their own perspectives, they all have their own opinions, they certainly all have their own egos, but they also have their own drivers. So if we understand who each of them are and what their motivation is, that's going to make it much easier for us to get everybody to work together. The key to getting this stuff happening is to do what we call a win-win-win-win scenario. And that's not always easy with 4 parties involved. You can guarantee somebody's going to get upset. So, first up, let's deal with the most important person, the customer. They've possibly already committed to some spend in Azure, which means the clock is ticking for them. Somebody senior from within IT has probably also promised the business that we're going to move into Azure and move away from an CapEx world to an OpEx world, and nothing's happening. They're blocked because the project is just not making any traction. Now, the customer can feel a lot of frustration with the hosting provider and with Microsoft at this point, just purely simply because of a lack of process. I wouldn't be happy if I was paying 2 sets of hosting bills when I only need to be paying 1. I wouldn't be very happy if I was promised this brave new world of OpEx and pay as you want and scalability, but still being stuck in a legacy data center. So it's important to understand what's going through the customer's mind. The hosting provider. Now, it's very easy to paint a picture of the hosting provider being an evil organization that's just trying to keep a hold of the customer and the revenue stream from the customer for as long as possible. And 99.9% of the time, that just isn't the case. These are just hard-working hosting providers, systems engineers and delivery managers like us that are just trying to protect their organization from their responsibilities. Just because the customer's decided to move out of their data center doesn't mean that the critical service level agreements that they're responsible for disappear. The hosting provider can still be on the line for a lot of penalty charges if services are offline. One of the key things to do right from the outset is get the customer and the hosting provider to agree to a temporary suspension of some of the SLAs during the migration process. Now, that might mean that whilst the service being migrated, it's not classed as needing to be available, or it might mean you temporarily reevaluate the service level agreements to which they're being held to. The way hosting providers and service delivery providers work is they give you an annuity charge for doing the core day-to-day things. And then anything that comes outside of the scope of that is a project. And quite rightly so, that project does have to be funded. Now, it can be seen as quite a hostile thing by the customer because all of a sudden we're just asking for something simple like one network port being opened, and the service provider turns that into, well, I've got to have a project manager, I've got to have an architect, I've got to do design documentation, then I've got to have somebody actually open up the network port for you. That can seem quite laborsome, but what you've got to remember is that hosting provider is really just thinking about the availability of your services and making sure things are done in the right way. It doesn't necessarily mean they're evil, it just means they're trying to work in a professional way. The problem is with this is that quite often these guys aren't evil, it's just that they're not very agile. The third person in the room is Microsoft. Now, Microsoft are really behind you and the customer on this. They want the migration to be a success. They don't have a lot of time to invest, even with large accounts. Quite often, a lot of the account managers that Microsoft provides sit at the end of a telephone and email and are maybe looking after maybe 200 or 1,000 customers. They don't get enough time to invest in a lot. They're not necessarily subject matter experts, but where these people will come out and fight in your corner is helping you establish your credibility. They'll help Microsoft establish the credibility of Azure itself. And also as well, there's a number of services that Microsoft can provide to you to help you with the migration. That can range from just providing information, design validation, but also as well, they have onboarding teams that can help with this. Also as well, one of the main benefits for Azure is the fact that you've got support available at the far end of this from Microsoft. So making sure that Microsoft are involved or engaged, they know what you're trying to do, they'll get them working for you. If there's a person engaged from Microsoft, they will most likely be recognized on how much Azure consumption the customer is going to do. And if they can see that you as a consultant or a systems engineer are going to drive towards the goal of driving up Azure consumption for this customer, they'll be right behind you. Then finally, let's take a look at you as the consultant. Well, if you're external, you're not going to get paid until this project's complete. You want to get in there and get this done as smoothly as possible. Unfortunately, you can be seen by the hosting provider as being a bit of a risk. You're not on their payroll, you can't control them. You're potentially asking for a lot of access to their systems. Also as well, you're asking for a lot of stuff that's quite disruptive to them as well. So there can naturally be a bit of tension between you and the hosting provider. So it's important to establish a good repertoire. Now, here, as I said before, you've got to master the art of a four-way win scenario. And the way to do this is to have in mind a set of objectives. Now, it's pretty difficult to bear in mind the needs of a hosting provider in a four-way win scenario where the customer is trying to move away from that hosting provider. But what I found is that by working with the hosting providers and saying, look, just because you're not hosting this stuff anymore doesn't mean to say this you're no longer relevant to this account. Demonstrate that you can be helpful with this, demonstrate you can get on board with this, and you can probably help rebuild some of your relationship with the customer. Let's take a look at some of the blockers that we might face in a hostile data center migration to Azure. Whilst the legacy hosting provider might not necessarily be wanting to derail a project, there's a number of practices that they have in place and controls and countermeasures they put in place to keep the customer's environment safe as it is today. What that means is it might be difficult for us to get permission from the hosting provider to implement management tools. I'm a big fan of using Azure Site Recovery Manager and Azure Migrate as my tool set for doing VMware to Azure migrations. However, there are some limitations for that. With some dependencies we have to meet, we have to put in place virtual appliances to collect information and to handle remediation of virtual machines. Now, it's very unlikely that a hostile service provider is going to allow us to deploy additional virtual machines onto what they see as their VMware estate. In a lot of cases, they're not even going to give us access to the hypervisor operating systems. So we're not going to be able to see the VMware. We're not going to be able to see the Hyper-V console on these machines. And it's probably even less likely we'll be able to get access to vCenter or Virtual Machine Manager that looks after these environments as well. Hosting providers, by their very nature, implement a lot of security controls. If they're going to be responsible for hitting a 99.99% service level agreement, you can guarantee that they can keep stuff safe by locking down network access. Unless it's been requested, there's probably a firewall rule and a proxy rule in place that's going to block traffic getting out. Now again, for Site Recovery Manager, that can be problematic. Although Site Recovery Manager and Azure Migrate encrypt all their traffic over SSL, traffic has got to get out to the public internet, to the service endpoints. And quite often it can be it can be near impossible to convince a service provider to allow one of their physical hosts or their virtualization management technology to talk to an external source. However, allowing the guest virtual machines to talk to a public internet service point is something that they can't block you from doing, because that's you getting your applications from working. Physical access. The chances of us being able to walk into a legacy service provider's data center and plug something in are non-existent. Now, whilst that wouldn't normally stop us with an Azure SRM migration, this is going to restrict our ability to maybe go in there and deploy some temporary swing hardware that we can move virtual machines to, or maybe we're going to run the assessment and remediation virtual machine roles from. Yeah. It also, as well, it's going to prevent us from using some of the scenarios like Azure Export Import or Azure Databox to handle migration as well. It's just going to rule some of those options out, unfortunately. Finally, a lot of hosting service providers have a policy about no unauthorized management agents being deployed into their environment. Now, most of the time, the reason why that's in place is to stop things doing some sort of heavy-duty performance monitoring that'll affect the performance of the Hyper-V or VMware cluster. Or maybe they're just using this as a way to keep the environment secure. So we have to be aware of these conditions. What we also have to do as well is we have to be quite clever in how we get around these restrictions to be able to make a migration happen. Now, fortunately, that means not using tools like Site Recovery Manager. It also means potentially having to put a bit of extra manual effort into these things as well. The roadblockers and challenges we've talked about in the previous slide are going to mean we need to change our approach. Now, normally, if I'm approaching a migration where we're moving stuff from an on-prem data center into Azure, I'm going to leverage Azure Migrate. I would leverage Azure Site Recovery Manager. I'd use the Microsoft Planning and Assessment Toolkit potentially, and I'm going to try and make as much use of VMware and Hyper-V integration as I can to make this as smooth as possible. Now, unfortunately, because the service provider is going to block network ports or not allow us to open up network ports, and we're not going to have access to some of this infrastructure, we've got to play smart here. Some of the things I've learned, now I call this kind of a stealth approach. What that means is we're not trying to do anything dishonest here. What we're doing though is working within the rules and controls implemented by the legacy hosting provider. What I found is if I use the Microsoft Planning and Assessment Toolkit to assess individual virtual machines in the environment, there's very little the service provider can do to prevent that. After all, we're just getting access to our servers to run a tool. There's no management agent involved in the map toolkit, and if we're very careful about how we configure it to do performance metric gathering, it's nice and smooth. Also as well, we can leverage a combination of either Azure Backup or System Center Data Protection Manager for backup and migration of the virtual machines. Quite often, there is going to be a level of remediation required to turn those virtual machines from playing nice on Hyper-V or playing nice on VMware into playing nice in Azure. Now, it might be that what we need to do is use that migration tool to pull those virtual machines out as a backup, put them into a kind of swing environment. Now, it might be some physical hosts you put into your environment back on-prem, or maybe you might be able to make use of some VMs in Azure to do this. But basically, you're going to give yourself a nice little workbench where you can remediate virtual machines, potentially manually, or maybe you're going to use some PowerShell to do that on an automated basis. One of the things we do is we use the idea of failing over from a backup. So what that means is there's going to be a bit of extra work for us to do around the logistics. When we take a backup of a server, we're going to need to do some testing. Then we're ready to do an actual production failover. We're going to need to go into the legacy environment, make sure we've got a current backup, shut down the on-prem machine, then start up the backup of it into Azure. So like I say, it's a little bit different from using Azure SRM. We're following a lot of the principles, but because of the limitations in place, quite often we're having to do a lot of work manually here. Normally for an IaaS migration, I would absolutely use the Azure Migrate toolkit. Azure Migrate's fantastic at discovering and assessing environments. It really is. It's a great tool. But because it's agent-based, it's going to require access to a vCenter database, and there are perceived risks from the hosting provider about performance monitoring, generating capacity demand. It's not always a great tool to use. You find it very difficult in some cases to get approval to use the Azure Migrate toolset. One of the other challenges we run into as well is some hosting providers will share a virtual machine manager instance or a vCenter instance to manage multiple customers' environments. So it wouldn't be right for them to give us access to that technology, especially if there's information in there for more than one customer. So how are we going to go about doing this? Well, let's try and remember here that the hosting provider is still actually providing you access to a service. You should have access to these servers, but through your own network. Let's face it, there's not much point in them hosting domain controllers for you and SQL Server databases if you can't access it using the normal ports. So presumably you're going to have some sort of network connectivity in place between the physical environment where you're working from and the servers where you're going to access these stuff from. One of the good things about the planning and assessment toolkit from Azure is it doesn't need a server, it's agentless as well, and it can discover Microsoft Windows and Linux workloads quite easily. We don't have to target VMware to do an assessment of computers. We don't even have to target Hyper-V. All we need to do is we need to select, tell the map toolkit to work with Windows servers and Linux machines. And we can do a Windows Azure platform migration assessment by communicating directly with the servers we want to move. Let's just communicate with the virtual machines and not the physical host, which might be difficult for us to get access to. We do discovery by querying Active Directory, and we pull back from there a list of Windows servers. If we've got Linux machines in our environment as well, depending on the way we've got AD and Samba set up in our environment, it might be necessary for us to provide a list of IP addresses and computer names for those machines as well. All communications the map toolkit is going to use are going to run from an administrative workstation. Setting up the map toolkit is quite simple, it only takes a couple of minutes, and the inventory workstation has a copy of SQL Server Express. What's going to happen then is the map toolkit machine is going to communicate with the servers that it discovers from Active Directory using a combination of remote procedure calls, LDAP, WMI, and WebM traffic. We're going to be communicating with the virtual machines and not the service provider's infrastructure or their tools. So this should be okay in most environments. We are going to need to get local admin access to these servers, or ideally domain admin rights for the forest. The idea being that the map toolkit does need to authenticate against these machines to pull information out of them. But again, this process is agentless, so we're not bound by having to install a management agent on any physical hosts or any virtual machines here. If you watched our other video on Azure IaaS migrations, you'll know that the discovery phase basically tells us what machines do we have, how big are they today, and what they're running. The assessment phase is all about taking a look at that information. And really what we're trying to do in the assessment phase is figure out three things. First thing is, based on the performance load of these machines, what's the correct size of virtual machine and storage to use in Azure? That then tells us how much it's going to cost to run this stuff in Azure. The other thing we want to know for an assessment as well is, what remediation work do we need to do on these servers to get them ready to run in Azure? Unfortunately, because if we were doing this in a hostile environment, the hoster isn't going to let us get access to vCenter, and they're possibly not going to let us access to the physical hosts either. That means we need to use a tool that plays nice to that kind of scenario. Fortunately for us, the Microsoft Planning and Assessment Toolkit is ideal. Why is it good for us? Well, first of all, we don't need to deploy a server to use the map toolkit. We can just install it on an administrative workstation. So if you've got a workstation in your environment that's got access to the domain controllers and you've got access to the servers, you can run the map toolkit from there. So remember, when whatever controls your hosting provider have put in place, they're still there to give you access to your servers. So it's entirely likely you're going to be able to communicate with these servers using the map toolkit. Again, the map toolkit is going to do a performance assessment of these computers. One thing we've done in the past to help customers feel a bit more safe about this is we've separated out running performance checks by breaking down groups of computers into, say, maybe 5 or 10 computers to run performance at any one time. That should negate the possibility of any massive performance bottlenecks happening with performance counters. From experience in running the map toolkit in quite large environments before, I've never really seen the performance counters cause any issues with performance unless it was on an already overcrowded hypervisor where these machines were running. But let's face it, you quite possibly, if you're trying to move out of that data center, it could be that there's a hardware constraints in place. So we want to be careful not to run performance assessment against all machines at one time. And all we do is just break it out. We just use a bit of smart administration and we just run the discovery against 5 or 10 machines at a time. The map toolkit pulls that information back about the actual performance of these machines, and it's going to give us a report on compatibility, and it's going to give us a report to help us figure out the capacity and pricing we're going to run into in Azure. Now we can answer the critical questions that we need to answer before even planning a migration. So we can now answer, just from information we've got from the map toolkit, how many servers need to be remediated, how many machines need to have SQL upgraded, how many servers need Windows or the Linux operating system upgraded to something that's supported. We can also answer the question of what's it going to cost to run these servers in Azure. And quite often when we've done these kind of exercises for customers, they've maybe been battling with maybe for 12 or 18 months to get at this information. And just that kind of dynamic of not being allowed to use managed discovery tools has prevented them from even getting this far. So now at least you've got the right information to put together a business case. This slide illustrates the process that we use for design, build, and actual execution of the migration. Some of the timeframes in here are based around our abilities and our recent experience. It's important to bear in mind that we've got some techniques and a lot of artifacts that we use to help us with this. So for example, our design workshops, we've already got agendas built out for those. We've got an approach for sign off and review that keeps it constrained to one cycle of review and rework. And we've got a lot of template documentation we're able to leverage without compromising on quality here for things like low-level design documents, test plans, migration plans, and change planning. We're doing this stuff over and over again, so it's natural to prepare for that stuff like that. We do what we can to accelerate implementation and spinning up of the environment in Azure and to get the environment ready as much as we can by using things like ARM templates and ARM runbooks to implement things. So for example, we've got scripts that deploy tagging, we've got standards we use for resource group creation, and Azure policies we've imported and exported to allow us to be able to build on these environments quite quickly. The process we're going to follow here is not to bypass design, but we are going to be clever and strategic about how we do design. The big question for the design phase is, do you include your current service provider? That's important. And basically, you've got to make a decision. And usually, I base it on this. If I genuinely feel that they're being supportive as they can, then I'll include them in the design workshops. But if I feel that they're deliberately trying to sabotage the move because they just want to keep the customer in their data center for longer, I'll be very careful about how and when we engage the customer. I'll make sure there are some ground rules in place that says, look, here's how you can and can't participate. We're not going to put up with any aggressive behavior from in these sessions. We're not going to allow you to come along and just disrupt it for the case of disrupting. They're going to have to follow some rules if they want to be involved in this. In some cases where the customer is proven, so where the hosting provider is proven to be hostile and disruptive, I'll speak with the executive sponsor from the customer and we'll remove the legacy hosting provider from the process. We'll still give them visibility of the artifacts at the end. We'll still give them the ability to review and veto things at the end, but it's ultimately they're asking for the customer to veto things. We'll still invite them along to the one review, one rework session calls, but they have to prepare their review points in advance of that. So anything that we see as just being deliberately blocking, we'll let them know in advance of the review call that, sorry, we're not going to talk about that because we can see what you're trying to get to with that. You're just trying to slow things down. Now that design process, the hosting provider really has a choice there. Do they want to engage? Do they want to do the right thing by the customer? Yeah. Or are they just going to want to disrupt? And you've got to make a decision as an architect based on how you think they're going to react. Having the customer's exec sponsor on side for this is critical. That's somebody you've got to take to one side. He's probably going to understand the political paradigm quite easily. He's probably feeling the impact of that political paradigm in his budgets at the moment. So having a conversation with him to say, look, we potentially need to control the way the current hosting provider works in here. We're probably going to have to accommodate some level of perceived risk for them as well. But just set that stuff in stone before you start. The next few weeks is all about implementing a nice, safe landing zone for our machines to be moved into from the current data center. Implementing an Azure subscription, implementing an Azure environment, putting the systems management tools in place are all quite simple and straightforward. That's real low risk stuff. Why? Because we're accessing stuff through the portal, we're making things happen in Azure. We've already got global admin rights in there, so it's pretty easy to get that stuff up and running. Like I say, we've templated and scripted a lot of this stuff to make it run nice and fast and smooth. There's 2 points in this process where things become a little bit tricky. And that's mostly because of politics. And that is when we implement hybrid networking. In an ideal world, we'd implement some sort of site-to-site VPN from the current data center into Azure. to give the migration the best chance of providing coexistence. However, yeah, if the legacy service provider wants to be hostile, they might prevent us from doing that. Why? Because we have to create a connection from one router to an endpoint in Azure, and if they want to disrupt, they'll just say no to that. So that might mean that we do something clever, like we connect the customer's office location to Azure instead, and we create like a triangular connection to Azure rather than going directly from the hosting data center. It's also important to note, though, that just because we've got connectivity from the physical data center back via the on-prem network, the migration tools we use with Azure Backup and Azure Site Recovery Manager all talk directly over the public internet to a public peering. So that migration traffic doesn't necessarily have to come back on-prem before it goes across, just because that's how we've got our VPN implemented. The site-to-site VPN or the express route, that's all about providing connectivity for your users to your machines after the migration. When we come along to implement hybrid identity management, the only really tricky part of that is extending your current Active Directory domain services forest or domain into Azure. What we need for that is a domain admin account. We need to be able to have the ports open that Active Directory uses between an existing domain controller and the new domain controller virtual machines we create in Azure. Not a very complex ask, but because of the way these people should be setting up your network, it's very difficult for them to prevent you from asking for those ports to be open, because they need to be open in order for Active Directory to do its job. So politically speaking, they don't have much of a leg to stand on if they're trying to block you from doing that, unless you've got something very nasty in your providing contract. Once we've extended Active Directory domain services by putting domain controllers into Azure, it's then very easy to complete the setup of Azure AD, to leverage Azure AD Premium to put in place some much more advanced directory services functionality like multi-factor authentication, cloud single sign-on, cloud applications, self-service password reset, and the sort of privileged access management technologies we use to really secure access to the Azure portal. And Azure AD Connect, that's real simple because we're just replicating from the domain controllers we have in Azure into Azure AD. That stuff is nice and simple from there. So there are two real key points there. And ideally, we get those sorted out during the design phase. We get an agreement in principle and the request for changes approved back in design for those 2 points. So what we've achieved by now is we've set everything up ready for us to do the migration. We've got our environment in place, we've got our tools in place, we've got our change plan in place. During the migration process, what we need to do is to make sure we've got the right approach in mind. Now, if the data center is very hostile, we might just want to do a big bang. Let's get us out of there as quick as possible. So we're using tools to back up machines, get them out of there, get them remediated, get them into Azure as quickly as possible. Or it may be that it's possible for us to do a more phased, controlled migration over time. We are going to want to do some level of piloting. We are going to want to do some level of functional and user acceptance testing, because there's no point at all in moving these workloads out of the current data center into Azure only to find that they perform really badly up there. Fortunately, Azure affords us the ability to take stuff, back it up, or migrate it with Azure Site Recovery Manager and put it into an isolated network. That means we can do non-disruptive testing. We can test this stuff without taking it offline in the legacy data center, and we can make sure it's going to work before we do either a phased or a big bang migration. Now, if we were going to use Azure Site Recovery Manager or Azure Migrate to do this migration, a lot of the logic of this is taken care of for us by the tools. So if we're having to use something like a virtual machine backup or data protection manager to export the data out of the environment, then do some remediation, it's important that we have a process in place that we understand for doing this. It's also important to have an understanding of what that means to the business. So what do we need to make sure we do? Well, we want to make sure before we start executing our migration, we've got some DevOps people on standby who know Azure IaaS, just in case we've got to change anything quickly when we move the resources into Azure or see what's wrong with something. Also as well, we probably want to have some Windows and Linux engineers on standby as well, just in case there's anything we need to change inside the operating system to get things working properly. The process we're going to follow to do this should mean that if we're doing a phased migration, we can probably get through this with about 15 minutes of downtime per virtual machine. And if we batch together a group of 5, 10, or 20 virtual machines into one batch, we get 15 minutes of outage for that batch of machines. Or if we're going to do a big bang approach, anything up to about 50 virtual machines, we've got that done in less than 2 hours using a big bang approach. The whole idea is to have a process where we prep and check, and do as much preparation as we can before we actually make the change. So that process starts off by us backing up the virtual machine. We don't take it offline to do that. We just use the Azure Migrate or the DPM or the Windows Backup Agent to do that. We then restore that virtual machine into a test virtual network in Azure. One of the nice things about the Azure Backup Agent is that we can back up the virtual machine straight from the guest into Azure, and all the communications just goes over the public internet over port 443. Once we get the machine into Azure, we power it up in a test VNet. It's isolated. We execute some testing on that, maybe some functional testing, maybe some user acceptance testing. If we find anything that's a bit screwy or not quite right with the machine, we'll put in place remediation, then we'll test it again. Then we sit down with the customer and we'll make a go or no-go decision. If the customer feels that workload's ready to go, we then do another backup to get the latest copy of the machine up to date. We shut down the virtual machine and we then restore that virtual machine into the production VNet. And if there was any manual remediation we needed to do, we'll do that as part of that. We then have moved that machine or that batch of machines into Azure. We'll continue to run through that process until we've completed all the batches and effectively drained out the legacy data center. There's still a little bit of cleanup work we need to do once we've moved all our workloads out of the legacy data center into Azure. So as we've gone through the migration, we'll have shut down virtual machines on-prem as we've powered them up in the production network in Azure. But now is the time to go back once we've completed the migration and make sure those virtual machines are deprovisioned from the hosting service provider's environment. We want to make sure that the hosting service provider commits to the idea that these machines are no longer billable. So depending on the service contract you've got in place, just having them switched off might not need to be enough. Maybe they need to be deleted from storage. Maybe they need to be deprovisioned from Hyper-V or VMware as well. So we issue the request for change to the service provider to make sure that stuff happens. Also as well, your hosting provider may or may not have obligations to dispose of your data in a secure fashion. That could mean that there are concerns around what happens to physical hard drives, what happens to legacy virtual machine information, what happens to any information that's held in their management tools. Now, whilst it's unlikely we can go in and change anything in there with those tools, they will have some level of responsibility to protect your data. If they no longer, the important thing to remember is that they no longer have a need to own or to maintain that data. And worst case scenario, you should be able to appeal to them under the Data Protection Act to have them delete that data off for you. It's important to bear that stuff in mind if you're moving out of their data center. The last thing you want is for any kind of passwords or virtual machine images to be accidentally exposed when they deprovision hardware or they recycle hardware. Now, it's unlikely that in any Azure migration, you'll be able to migrate absolutely everything to Azure. There are a lot of things where you may need to retain a traditional data center for. So for example, Dynamic Host Protocol, DHCP, it's essential to most Microsoft networks. You can't run that in Azure yet. You've got things that are connected into legacy mainframe systems. You might have things that are collected into your telephony that's possible to do in a traditional hosted data center that can't be done in Azure. So right at the start, as you start planning your way through this, try and bear in mind that it could be that there are some elements of hosting that you need to retain this service provider for. And we should bear that in mind in our approach with them as we move through. Hopefully you'll get to the point where you can at least resize your hosting contract. Now, potentially, if you've managed to move everything out, that's fine and good. But you do need to consider, does this relationship need to move forward? And that's something that we need to begin with that end in mind. Then it's time that you can get your legal people involved if necessary to help terminate the contract and to make sure that you're not going to get hit with any hidden charges or penalties. Thanks for taking the time out to watch this video. I really hope the last 40 minutes has given you some insights into the sort of things you can expect when moving out of a hostile data center, and hopefully it's given you some inspiration and some ideas about how you can move forward a bit more smoothly. When recording these videos, there's a whole bunch of information that we can't put in there. Now, nobody's going to want to watch a video that's 5 hours long on this subject. So if there are specific questions you want answered, feel free to reach out to us. I'd like to introduce you to Cindy Hast. Cindy's our business development director, but don't worry, she's quite tame. You can reach out to Cindy using these contact details. Cindy will be more than happy to set up like a one-to-one call with you, with either myself or one of the architects on my team. And the idea is we can give you answers to stuff face to face. We're quite happy to take and respond to questions by email as well. So as we close out, I just wanted to remind everybody that 7% of the money you spend with Microsoft on Azure or Microsoft 365 or Dynamics 365 is reserved as what's called partner of record revenues. Partner of record means Microsoft takes 7% of the money you spend with them and make that available to the partner that looks after your Azure or Dynamics or Microsoft 365 environment. What that means is Microsoft are funding partners to do work for you with the money, the investment you're already making. What we do for partner of record, customers that set us as partner of record, we use that money to fully fund your Azure migration. And we also use it to provide an ongoing managed service to monitor, maintain, backup your services in Azure. So if that's of interest to you, please feel free to reach out to Cindy and myself. We'll be quite happy to get in touch with you and talk you through what's involved in that. Thanks very much for taking the time to watch this video, and good luck with your Azure migration.